Good morning. Good morning, everybody. Hear these words from the Gospel of Mark, chapter 5, verses 21 through 43. When Jesus had again crossed over by boat to the other side of the lake, a large crowd gathered around him while he was by the lake. Then one of the synagogue rulers, named Jairus, came, and when he saw Jesus, he fell at his feet. He pleaded earnestly with him, "My little daughter is dying. Please, come and put your hands on her so that she will be healed and live." So Jesus went with him. A large crowd followed and pressed around him. And a woman was there who had been subject to bleeding for 12 years. She had suffered a great deal under the care of many doctors and had spent all that she had, but instead of growing better, she got worse. When she heard about Jesus, she came up behind him in the crowd and touched his cloak, because she thought, if I just touch his clothes, I will be healed. Immediately her bleeding stopped, and she felt in her body that she was freed from her suffering. At once, Jesus realized that power had gone out from him. He turned around in the crowd and said, "Who touched my clothes?" His disciple answered, "You see the people crowding all around you, and yet you can ask, 'Who touched me?'" But Jesus kept looking around to see who had done it. Then the woman, knowing what had happened to her, came and fell at his feet, and trembling with fear, told him the whole truth. He said to her, "Daughter, your faith has healed you. Go in peace and be freed from your suffering." While Jesus was still speaking, some people came from the house of Jairus, the synagogue leader. "Your daughter is dead," they said. "Why bother the teacher further?" Overhearing what they said, Jesus told him, "Don't be afraid, just believe." He did not let anyone follow him except Peter, James, and John, the brother of James. When they came to the home of the synagogue leader, Jesus saw a commotion with people crying and wailing loudly. He went in and said to them, "Why all this commotion and wailing? The child is not dead but asleep." But they laughed at him. After he put them all out, he took the child's father and mother and the disciples who were with him and went in where the child was. He took her by the hand and said to her, "Talitha cum," which means, "Little girl, I say to you, get up." Immediately, the girl stood up and began to walk around. She was 12 years old. At this, they were completely astonished. He gave them strict orders not to let anyone know about this and told them to give her something to eat. This is the word of the Lord. Thanks be to God.
So this morning, we have the privilege of welcoming a special guest preacher. Dr. Gary Burge is joining us from Calvin Theological Seminary. Hold your applause for Calvin, best school in town. I attended there, if you didn't know that, now you do. Gary came on to the faculty a year after I left, so, disappointing for me, but probably better for him that he didn't have to put up with me in his classes. Gary is a New Testament scholar. He has joined us here at Thornapple before. He came a few years ago when our former senior pastor, Rob Peterson, was on his sabbatical. You may remember that Gary came and did I think it was a 4-week series for us then, and we really appreciated that. He then later led a trip in which I think like 40 people from Thornapple all went together to Israel and got to see many sites in the Holy Land and learn lots of things from Dr. Burge himself. So it is a privilege to welcome him here today. As we looked at this series, we are in this series called What Did Jesus Do? We're going through the Gospel of Mark and looking at what Jesus did while he was here on earth. And today, we've got some of the craziest, most unbelievable things he did, namely bringing somebody back from the dead. So I am excited to hear from an expert on what is going on in this passage. I'm going to turn things over to Dr. Burge.
Thank you. Oh, let's go ahead and give it up for Calvin. Why not? It's just proof we'll let anyone into Calvin. So good to see you. I just have been looking forward to coming back and visiting with you all. I just love the church you have. It's just wonderful. And I got to know so many people when I went to Israel with them. Every time I come here, I always think to myself, you guys have an amazing worship team. I'm just saying, do you agree? It's incredible. These guys are good. They're amazing, even though Tracy Dance is in it. So anyway, but it's just, you have just wonderful worship. You do. Well, I was delighted when you called me and said, well, we're working through the Gospel of Mark, and could you work on something like Mark chapter 5? I thought, yeah, that would be great. That would be a very, very interesting exercise. And I think that we are going to learn some things here that we haven't probably seen before in the Gospel of Mark. Now, have you ever been in a social setting where you have felt like a complete outsider? Well, when I moved to West Michigan, I certainly did. In 2017, we moved to Chicago, from Chicago, Wheaton, to Calvin Seminary here in Grand Rapids. And so I remember in my first year, I was actually speaking at a CRC church. And after church, some fella came up to me and he says, your last name is Burge. Is that Dutch? And he says, because I have a relative in Holland that, he's starting to do this. Anyway, I said, no, through my dad. I think it's a German thing. So anyway, he goes, so you're not Dutch. Is your mother Dutch? No. And I said, well, no, there's not a drop of Dutch blood inside of me. And he says, well, how are they letting you teach at Calvin Seminary? I thought to myself, wow, that's really a remarkable conversation. I haven't had, so therefore it was like, here is one entity, and then there's me out here somewhere. Do you know what I'm saying? Anyway, so have you ever had this thing where you've just felt like you were just outside of the line, sort of like, there were moments at Wheaton College where I wanted to say, hey, I voted for Barack Obama amidst all my Republican students. That was fun too. It was just like, oh, really? He would do that? How can you still be a Christian? Anyway, there are these moments where you find yourself kind of on the outside of this thing, and it isn't always, it's awkward. It really is awkward. Now, take that idea and sort of spin that in a slightly different way. Imagine that you held some secret. Imagine that you held some condition, some status that could not be unmasked. Imagine if you had some status and you just simply could not tell anyone who's around you. Imagine that you had some economic secret. I have a friend who actually went bankrupt a few years back. And do you think he's told any of his friends? Nope, no way. Imagine that you had some health secret. Imagine that it was something that you were so ashamed of or so worried about or so curious about how people might react that you kept it a secret. Imagine that you had a family secret. Imagine that you had children that didn't turn out the way you thought they would. Imagine that life just simply hasn't brought to you the things that you wanted, and you had this amazing disappointment. And so therefore you say to yourself, I feel like I have a stigma of some kind on top of me. Imagine if some way you have disqualified yourself. You've disqualified yourself from your own eyes. You've disqualified yourself from the community that you're in. In some manner, things aren't working out for you. And you keep it all a secret. You have an addiction. You have an addiction. I have had student friends who have addiction to drugs, pornography, gambling. I know what addiction looks like because that's been among my friends. I'm amazed they told me about that. I had a student who once said to me, I am HIV positive. And he was looking in my eyes to see if I would take a half step back. Imagine holding something like that. Imagine that you've had a failed marriage. Imagine that you've had a loss of employment. And all of this makes you, in your own mind, unclean. Everybody else has got their act together. Everybody else seems to be doing fine. I read Facebook. Everybody is doing swimmingly. But not me. I don't get to post all of these amazing pictures of everybody having fun. Now, here in Mark chapter 5, we have one of the great stories inside of the Bible. The problem is, inside of this story, we have things that we don't understand. From where we are in the 21st century, it's impossible to know what is going on in Mark chapter 5. It is. We meet in the middle of the chapter a woman who has been ill for 12 years. This is just not an ordinary illness. This is something that has incredible symbolic importance inside of Jesus' world. And so therefore we have got to take a detour or two in order to understand it. Mark chapter 5 is asking a very simple question. Is Jesus clean or unclean? We're not talking here about hygiene. We're not asking if he takes baths or uses soap. We're talking about a status. And we don't have that status inside of our world. But this is a status that had so obsessed Jews in the first century from about AD 150 BC until about AD 100. For approximately 250 years, Judaism all around Jesus' life was obsessed with this idea that it's possible to have something affect your life and it would create a disorder in you that is socially unacceptable. They saw it almost like a virus that you could catch. And once you had it, you had to work very hard to get rid of it. So the question here in this passage is Jesus unclean? And the passage spins into another direction, asking, are you unclean? And can he do anything about it? Now, we have actually four episodes inside of the chapter. Here, I've just given you a nice outline. We have a man who is in a cemetery. He is with demons. That's the opening. That, by the way, is a cemetery in Gerasa. And then secondly, we have the story of a very sick girl who is presented to Jairus, the leader of a synagogue, comes and says, I have a sick daughter. She's 12 years old. Can you help? And then we have the story about a very sick woman who has this hemorrhage for 12 years, and she comes and she touches Jesus. And then what happens is we go back to the story of the little girl who then dies, and Jesus ends up in the house. Do you see that? So we have 4 episodes, and the episodes are absolutely linked. You can't pull one of these away from the others. So actually, it comes down to three stories, because we return to the little girl in the house. It is a story about a man in a cemetery, it's a story about a bleeding woman, and it's a story about a dead girl. Do you see how that works? We just have the dead girl story split up into 2 parts. So we have 3 things going on inside of this story, and to see them, we have to understand this idea of clean and unclean. Now, so here's the detour. Everybody knows that Judaism is very sensitive to things about, well, food you eat. It also includes the clothes you wear. And so most of you all know, for instance, Jews do not eat pork. So I have a nice picture of a pig up here. That is the tip of the iceberg. This is nothing. This is easy. This is easy. But the concern about clean and unclean goes way, way beyond this. Because what happens is that Jews in the first century had this notion that this status, this disorder, this can be attached to things. It can actually move through your house. So that if somebody actually is unclean and they step into your house and they sit on your furniture becomes unclean. So therefore, there are certain surfaces that unclean will attach itself to, such as pottery. So I have up here some pottery vessels. If those become unclean, you might as well break them. You cannot purify them. But if you have glass vessels, they cannot have unclean permanently attached to them. Leather can become unclean, steel cannot. Stone jars can be cleansed again, pottery no. There are numerous rules about this, and so therefore you navigate your world making sure you know what is and isn't unclean. And if you become unclean, you have to know how to correct it. Now, you can see this laid out for us right here in a really nice passage from Mark chapter 7, because Mark isn't sure that you're going to understand all of this, and so Mark writes, "The Pharisees and some of the teachers of the law had come from Jerusalem and gathered around Jesus and saw some of his disciples eating food with hands that were defiled, that is, unwashed." That's code language. Defiled means they're unclean, not hygiene. It's that somehow they have gone through the marketplace and touched things, and how can you be sure that you haven't touched something unclean? Therefore, you have to put your hands through ritual washing. The Pharisees and all of the Jews did not eat unless they'd given their hands a ceremonial washing. That's a very different thing. Holding to the tradition of the elders. When they come from the marketplace, they do not eat unless they wash. And they observe many other traditions, such as the washing of cups and pitchers and kettles. So we're not talking about cleaning up the kitchen here. We are talking of having special ritual water that you pour over your hands or your kettle or your pot or whatever in order to restore them to clean. Here, look at this from Mark 7. Jesus called the crowd and said to him, "Listen to me, everyone, and understand. Nothing outside you can defile you by going into you." If you were a rabbi and you heard him say that, you'd think, wait a minute. That is so controversial. That's scandiculous. Rather, it is what comes out of you that makes you unclean. Whoa. So it's what comes out of you that really is defiling. It isn't what comes into you. That's amazing. Here in John chapter 2, do you remember the story about the wedding of Cana where Jesus turns water into wine? Nearby stood 6 stone water jars, the kind that the Jews used for ceremonial washings. What are those? They are jars. The Israel Museum in Jerusalem has a number of them. They're about this big, and stand about this high, and they collected rainwater. And because that rainwater came directly from the hands of God, you could use it to change your status to clean. So anyway, they hold 20 or 30 gallons, and Jesus said, fill the jars with water. They filled them to the brim. He said, now draw some out. So anyway, the miracle of Cana is a miracle enacted on jars designed not for drinking, but for cleaning, ritual cleansing. That's what they're designed for. I brought with me a picture of one of those jars from the Israel Museum. I thought you'd like to see it. They're made of stone. They're not pottery. That thing is carved from solid piece of stone because stone cannot take on the properties of unclean. If it's pottery, it can. Now, if you happen to be unclean, if it happens to be that you have touched something or you have acquired this status, the solution is actually fairly simple. What you do is you find a ritual bath. This is a ritual bath, and it's called a mikvah in Hebrew, and this is a really nice one. Ignore the water at the bottom. This is all rainwater and it's dirty. Anyway, you go down one side, you immerse, and you come out again. You immerse naked, and you come out again, and what happens is you now have a status of clean. It actually has a roof over the top of it. It would be very carefully built. But it collects things like rainwater or spring water, things which have come directly from the hand of God. Now, we find these all over Israel. We do. They're every place. And we know we are in a Jewish building from 2,000 years ago simply because we can find a mikvah. All right, so that's what I have to do if I'm going to fix this thing. Now, here's the other thing. There are many ways that you can become unclean, but most of the Jews living in this period of time understood there were 4. 4 things that you had to watch out for all the time. The first is Gentile contact. If you have contact, even if the shadow of a Gentile falls on you, you now are in the status of unclean. You don't touch Gentiles. Second thing is skin disease. This is why the New Testament, the Gospels talk about leprosy so often. The word lepros doesn't mean the leprosy, Hansen's disease. It means any skin irregularity. This is a culture that did not really practice hygiene the way you and I do. Soap was not being used and hot water, that changes everything for a human. So skin disease was something they really did worry about. Third is what's called corpse impurity. That is to say, if you have contact with a dead body or you walk through a cemetery, you will become unclean. See, you have to bury people, so you expect to become unclean. You just have to fix it that night. And then fourthly, bodily discharges. I always have a really tough time on this one when I'm talking to students, and especially in churches. We're kind of weird about this. My Middle Eastern friends say to me, Gary, in the West, you really make sex public on TV and movies and everything, but you're afraid to talk about, I don't know, circumcision, tampons, and menstruation. It's all kept quiet. But in our culture, we make sex private, and everybody talks about this stuff. They don't worry about it. It's a natural course of things. So anyway, in the biblical world, you'll have open conversations about this. In fact, there's a whole chapter in the Jewish law just about women and their menstrual period. What do you do about that? Isn't that incredible? It's 2,000 years old. All right, so these are the four things, because there's blood present in a menstrual period, and also men participate in this as well. And if you want to, at the coffee hour, men come to me and I'll tell you what they're really talking about. Anyway, so bodily discharges. Now, so when you look at these three stories and you ask yourself, what is actually going on? I have a man in a cemetery, and that presents Jesus with the problem of what? Corpse impurity. It's a cemetery. It has death in it. So as Jesus is inside of that cemetery with this demon-possessed man, he is automatically unclean. Corpse impurity. Then he walks into a village, and there is a bleeding woman who is there. This, we assume, is either cervical cancer or something. It is vaginal bleeding. This is not bleeding from her arm. This is vaginal bleeding. So therefore, she comes to him. It's all code language to say that she is actually in this status of unclean because of her bleeding. So therefore, she touches him and thereby makes him unclean. Then he walks into a house, and a little girl has just died. And when someone dies in your house, I told you, the entire house now takes on the status of unclean, because it's almost like a vapor, unclean is, and it just permeates everything. It's a big deal when someone dies in your house. He just walks straight into the house, and he touches the little girl. And he says, "Get up." So here in these episodes, what I have again and again is the same kind of pattern. The same kind of pattern, and it all, if you notice carefully in Mark 5, it all comes down to touching. Because that is the most obvious way that you actually become unclean. It is what you touch. That thing you're going to touch can transmit it to you. Now, this is why, if you look carefully in Mark 5, 6 times it says Jesus is a toucher. He touches, because he's not concerned about unclean. Now, the rule is this in this culture. If something is unclean and I touch it and I am in the status of clean, unclean transmits to clean. Do you see how that works? If this is stained and I touch it, I become stained. Clean never transmits to unclean. So if I'm in a status of clean and I touch someone who is unclean, no, they don't become clean. I take on the properties of unclean. See that, Rose? We're going to use that here in a moment. These are all things that are just really enormous inside of the culture. See, this is why it's so hard to do Mark chapter 5. You can't unless you take these detours. But here comes the biggest one, and that is, what about women and purity? There is a great deal that we know about this from the first century. This is one of my favorite mosaics, by the way. This is of a woman who is in a mosaic on the floor of a beautiful city just north of Nazareth. It's called Sepphoris. All right, so what do we know? We know that there are laws, there are ritual laws, which are requiring certain things from women. It says in Leviticus 15, if you are in your menstrual period, you are ritually unclean for at least 7 days. I was one time just going through this material, and I was talking to one of my classes about it, and I had an African student named Haran. And Haran said, I said, "Haran, you're from Kenya. and you come from a village in Kenya. And I said, is this common that you would separate women on their period? And he says, of course. You mean Americans don't? When a woman's in her period or has a baby, you've got to keep her locked up. I said, good, I'm going to take that to my next audience. Thank you very much for that. He says, no, in my village, women don't go to church when they're in their period. 7 days. And after they have a baby, it's 3 months. They don't go to church. I said, okay, that's fine. So in Leviticus 15, unclean for 7 days. There are rules in Leviticus 12 for how long you have to be out of circulation when you give childbirth. She defiles everything that she touches. So if you are in the status of unclean through your menstrual period, anything you touch becomes unclean. You may not touch others. You may not sit on anyone's furniture. You may not come near stored water or food, and you cannot let your clothes touch another person. You are excluded from all social gatherings. You may not go to the temple or the synagogue. Isn't that astonishing? That is commonly known by the people in Jesus' world. They just all know this, and they accept it, like my student Haran accepts it. Now, we also know from one historian who wrote around the time of Jesus, named Pliny, he actually talks about blood in Roman culture, and this is in the thinking of just the average person. Listen to this. This is from Pliny's Natural History. Contact with the monthly flow of women turns wine sour. It makes crops wither. It'll kill a skin graft. She can dry seeds in gardens. She causes the fruit to fall off of trees. If she touches a bright mirror, she will dim it. She can dull the edge of steel and the gleam of ivory. She will kill bees. She will rust iron and bronze. Dogs who come near to a woman in her menstrual period will become mad, and their bite becomes poisonous. That is awesome. That is amazing. I'm so glad I found that paragraph. Anyway, there is all this in blood in Roman culture that's amazing. Here's another one. A thread from an infected dress is sufficient to do all of this. If linen that is being washed and boiled is touched by such a woman, it will turn black. Such a woman has magic power. She can drive away a hailstorm and whirlwinds if she shows herself when lightning flashes. Now, all I'm simply saying to you is that there's a lot of legislation about this. There's a truckload of information about this. And if you're tapped into it, suddenly this story takes on new meaning. All right, so therefore, what can we say about this woman? We can say that she's isolated from her community, that's for sure. She is feared by anyone who come near her. She is undoubtedly poor. She's in this status for 12 years, seriously? She's desperate. She is unable to gain help. She's tried the doctors, and so therefore she is excluded from everything religious. All right, now let's reconstruct the setting of what we think we have here then. So Jesus has just arrived in a village. He has just come from a cemetery, and I am sure that the rabbis in the village have wondered, has he visited a mikvah? Now, you know in the Gospels that Jesus actually doesn't just surprise a village. This is a shame-honor culture, and so therefore it says in the Gospels, he sends two ahead of him. There's a reason for that, because he wants to tell the village that the great teacher healer is arriving, and they don't want to be unprepared. So the elders of the village are prepared. They are dressed in their finery. This is an honoring moment. The great teacher of Nazareth is now coming into the village. The great elders are going to meet him in the public street. The crowds are going to be everywhere. This is a moment to be proud of in the village. That is why Jairus arrives. He is the great leader of the village. He is the distinguished synagogue leader. He has the finery to show it. He is well educated and well groomed. He falls at Jesus' feet, and that is astonishing. He asks for a healing for his daughter. It is riveting socially because in events like this, the population of the village would show up. Now, at that moment, in the middle of the street when Jesus is there with his entourage and Jairus is there with his sort of want-to-be elders, and then the crowd is all around. Threading her way through the crowd is a woman well known in the entire village. Everyone knows that she has this status. It would have been known to everyone. She makes her way through the crowd and she touches everyone she moves through. She's moving through the crowd. She is in the status of unclean, and whomever she touches becomes. This is an honoring moment. This is a great moment for the village. Jairus is here. Our leaders are here. She electrifies the crowd. Certainly the elders are furious. This is a catastrophe. She shouldn't be there. She is desperate. So she throws all caution to the wind and goes for it. Whoa. Now, we have to take one more detour to get this story right. And we have to know how to get dressed 2,000 years ago. Isn't this fun? Do you guys like doing these little I love this kind of stuff. Anyway, this is why I go to Israel all the time. All right, this is the earliest painting we possess of any Jew getting dressed. It comes from northern Syria in an excavation called Dura Europos. It's on the Euphrates River. They removed all of these beautiful paintings, and they're now in the Damascus National Museum. They're amazing. Now, what's important is that we have no other paintings at any place about this. You can see that they're wearing robes, very, very Roman. This is a very Roman look here. But I think the key here, here's an artist, Peter Connolly, who has actually taken some of these pictures and put them in books and things. So you can see that these are the depictions here, very Roman garb. And we think that probably in the first century that was true as well. But there was one thing that the Jews did that set them apart. It was anchored in the law. Now, every woman in the room knows that whenever you have a hem on a dress, it's going to be circular. You probably don't think about it, but it's circular. But the Jews decided that they were going to be different than all of their Gentile peers, and they were going to cut a square hem. That meant that you had four corners hanging down at the edge of your garment, and you always wore a flowing robe. So you had four corners. Okay, got that. You got the four corners now. And then it says this in the book of Numbers. Speak to the Israelites and say this, throughout the generations to come, you are to make tassels on the corners of your garments. So on the four corners, you actually take thread and run them through, and that's called a tassel, with a blue cord on each tassel. You will have these tassels to look at, so you will remember the commands of the Lord, and you will obey them. So this was how it was a giveaway for Jewish clothes. Four corners on a square-cut hem, and then strings hanging down on the four corners. That's what everyone knew. Now, here, you can have whenever people have an opportunity to show their wealth in public, why not use your tassels? So therefore, notice, when they got out of the boat, immediately the people recognized and ran through the whole neighborhood and began to bring sick people on pallets to the place where they heard Jesus was. And whenever he came in villages, cities, or the country, they laid sick. They laid sick in the marketplace and besought him that they might even touch what? It is not his clothes, it is to touch his tassels. That's what people want to do. Because these tassels were decorated, and the more powerful you were, the more profoundly you decorated your tassels. They became a thing of pride. It's really kind of strange. Now, they're called in Hebrew a tzitzit. That's what a tassel is, and here I just have a modern picture of one because Jews still use this today. But the tassel, the sort of the embellishments that go with your tassels, they were a sign of your authority. It was a sign of your identity. You had 8 strings that came down, and you had 4 strings, you see, that you pulled up through the circle, and then you brought them back down. That gave you 8, and then you put 5 knots in it. They had all this kind of organized, okay? Now, if you wanted to divorce your wife, you simply cut off her tassels. That was really, okay, that's it. If you grasp the tassel of someone, you are laying access to their own authority. So therefore, if a prophet wanted to send a message someplace and wanted to show, this is Isaiah speaking to you, cut off a piece of his tassel and send it maybe with a lock of hair. And that means you're listening to Isaiah. So therefore, what we have inside of this story is not simply a woman who wanted to hold on to his robe, not at all. This is a woman who is reaching out to access the power and the identity of Jesus. In the village, she is threading through because she is hoping to grab his tassel, his tzitzit. And therefore, she is hoping that that power will change her. This is why Jesus stops immediately and says, "Power has gone out of me. Who touched my tzitzit?" Well, in this crowd, all kinds of people are touching you, and the apostles know this. But somebody has touched him with intention. So the woman, of course, when she hears this, she is afraid. But Jesus turns to her and blesses her. And watch carefully in verse 34 says, "You are a daughter of Israel." This woman who lived on the margin and the outside of this entire village, he labels now as an insider. You are a daughter of Israel. So therefore, there are a couple things, that I want to see here. This woman is a daughter. Jairus has just said his daughter needs to be served. She has been sick for 12 years. This little girl is 12 years old. And therefore, what's odd about this is that Jesus, in affecting this woman's life, has just passed clean to unclean. Now, this is what the story is actually saying. Jesus has the capacity of ignoring the rules of unclean because they don't affect him. But he is the one person in whom clean is so powerful that if somebody unclean touches him, they become clean. There is no precedent for that anywhere in Judaism during this period. Jesus cannot be made unclean. Jesus passes clean to unclean, not the reverse. Now, the tragedy. Of course, the delay in the village, the girl has died. The woman now has turned Jairus' home into an unclean place because of corpse impurity. The entire house is now unclean. Mourners have probably shown up. Jairus is in tears. The little girl is dead. Jesus is unaffected by the report, unaffected by the mourners, unaffected by the idea of corpse impurity. So he says, Peter, James, and John may have the privilege of watching what comes next, along with the parents. Peter, James, and John are selected only in one other place for this kind of privilege, and it's at the Transfiguration. They are going to be able to see something no one else sees. Jesus steps into the house, and he says, Talitha cum. There are only about 6 or 7 places in the entire New Testament where the actual Aramaic words of Jesus were remembered and recorded in Greek. It literally in Greek says, Talitha cum. This was remembered by the apostles Peter, James, and John and kept in the tradition and memory of the church because Jesus said it. Little girl, get up. Jesus touches this corpse. Those who are untouchable will be touched by him. She gets up after 12 years of old, and she then joins her family. Now, we all love this story. We absolutely love the story of the woman who's in the town, the village, although we don't understand entirely what's going on. We love this story. We love retelling it. For most sermons in the church, this story is about one thing. It is about the gesture of the woman, her boldness given her infirmity, her courage to step out and interrupt Jesus. Sometimes we learn all about tassels, we learn about tzitzits, we are reminded to grasp onto Jesus when you're in trouble, and that's all true. I've given that sermon more than once. But I don't think that's the heart of the story. I think we've missed this entirely. The heart of this story is about unclean and clean. That's the heart of the story. It is about Jesus who is able to pass clean to those who are unclean. It is about Jesus who is unperturbed by the status of another. It is about Jesus who embodies clean so powerfully it can affect you. No condition of body or soul which isolates us from our community is beyond God's reach. Anything that makes us disqualified is precisely where Jesus wants to touch. So the image for us here looks like this. If you want to carry an image home with you, it's this. It is Jesus holding the hand of a young corpse. It is Jesus holding the small hand of a little girl, unperturbed about her status and eager to bring her back to life. So, for me it says, okay, I need to know that there is no condition in my life that excludes me from the reach of Jesus. That is why the story says 6 times Jesus touches. Arise from your bed is the message of the gospel in Mark chapter 5. Talitha cum is Jesus' word to you. Arise. But I also have to move this story in a second direction, and this one I think is tougher. I also need to know that if the unclean did not intimidate Jesus, I want to know, who are the unclean around me? Do we live in a society that draws a circle and says, those people really are unclean, but those inside this circle are clean? So the question really is, if we are incorporating the body of Christ into the world, if we are the hands of Jesus for the world, my question is, who is it in my world that needs to be touched, that needs to know that that status of unclean that they think disqualifies them needs to be set aside? If Jesus were here now, whom would he touch? Put it this way. Whom does the world not want to touch? Here in Grand Rapids, where is it? Do we have people that we live with inside of this world that we say, they're untouchable? What is the thing in the world that the world least expects us to do, where we are least comfortable? I want to be someone who lives inside of this world, who recognizes not only that I have been set free and made clean, but that I am an agent of the gospel that moves courageously through the world and completely unintimidated by those who are outside our margins. I'll even talk to people who are not Dutch. Let me know at the coffee hour.